The story opens far back in ancient China, during the reign of a ruthless conqueror remembered as the Dragon Emperor. With brutal force, he crushed every kingdom that stood in his way and forced his prisoners into hard labor, using them to help construct the Great Wall of China. Even after achieving unmatched power, wealth, and victory, the emperor wanted something greater than a throne. He wanted to live forever. To gain immortality, he sent his trusted general Ming to search for a sorceress named Zi Yuan, a woman believed to possess the secret to eternal life. But the mission did not unfold the way the emperor expected. Ming and Zi Yuan fell deeply in love, and when the emperor learned of their forbidden relationship, his rage was immediate. He had Ming executed and then attacked Zi Yuan, stabbing her in cold blood. As the emperor struggled through the pain that followed, sand began pouring from his eyes. Zi Yuan had placed a curse upon him. Within moments, the mighty ruler and his entire army were transformed into stone, frozen in place for thousands of years. The film then moves forward to 1946 in Oxfordshire, England. Rick O'Connell, now a husband and father, is trying to enjoy a quiet fishing trip. But things quickly go wrong. After several failed attempts and growing irritation, Rick abandons patience altogether and uses a rifle to catch his fish. Feeling oddly proud of himself, he brings the result back and shows it off to his butler, Jameson. Once inside his mansion, Rick begins putting away his fishing equipment, but his attention drifts toward his old military uniform sitting in the corner. For a moment, memories of danger, travel, and past adventures come rushing back. Life has become peaceful, but Rick clearly misses the thrill. Meanwhile, his wife, Evelyn O'Connell, is in town attending a public reading for her popular Mummy book series. During the question-and-answer session, a woman asks whether Evelyn's life is still as exciting as it was during the war years. The question catches her slightly off guard. Evelyn smiles politely and admits, in a careful way, that she sometimes wishes things were still that thrilling. Later that night, Rick and Evelyn sit down for dinner at home. Their conversation starts casually, but Evelyn soon brings up their son Alex. She is worried because she has written him 3 letters and has not received a single reply. Rick becomes visibly disappointed and says Alex only seems to contact them when he wants money, especially after walking away from school. He makes it clear that he feels his son has no real interest in building a proper relationship with him. But while Alex has led his parents to believe he is still in college, the truth is completely different. He is actually in China's Ningxia region, working at an archaeological dig site. There, he continues his search for the legendary tomb of the Dragon Emperor. Alex meets up with one of his closest allies, Professor Roger Wilson, who motivates him to keep pushing forward with the expedition. As they reconnect, a group of Chinese workers digging nearby accidentally uncovers a hidden gate. Alex and his team move through the debris to examine what lies beyond. After blasting open the entrance, they step inside, only to nearly lose their lives when the first booby trap is triggered. Carefully, they continue deeper into the underground palace. Along the way, they discover a corpse and accidentally activate another trap, causing parts of the ceiling to come crashing down. The collapse opens up the chamber and reveals an astonishing sight, an enormous army of stone soldiers, hundreds of thousands of them standing silently in formation. Alex and his crew are left speechless. But the danger is far from over. One of the men steps into yet another trap by mistake, and 3 members of Alex's team are killed. Alex is shaken and begins to panic, but Wilson manages to calm him enough for them to continue. Eventually, they discover a feng shui compass that appears to be facing the wrong way. When they adjust it into the proper position, the floor suddenly gives way. Alex falls into a dark pit below, while Wilson barely manages to grab the ledge and hang on. After landing hard, Alex slowly gathers himself and looks around the chamber. The floor is littered with skulls and bones. As he sweeps his flashlight across the darkness, the beam stops on a statue standing in the center of the room. It is the Dragon Emperor himself, still trapped in stone. Alex calls up to Wilson and tells him what he has found, but when no answer comes from above, he grows uneasy. Suddenly, an assassin appears without warning and attacks him. Alex dodges, counters, and fights back, but the attacker forces him toward a closing stone door. As he struggles to free himself, the assassin's veil shifts, revealing that the attacker is a woman. Thinking fast, Alex grabs a nearby vase and wedges it in place, stopping the stone door just before it crushes his head. Above him, Wilson avoids gunfire and manages to escape as the assassin is knocked back by the shots. Back in Oxfordshire, the quiet life of Rick and Evelyn is interrupted when Benjamin Fry, an agent from the British Foreign Office, comes to visit them. Although the O'Connells are supposed to be retired from dangerous missions, Fry offers them one last assignment. He wants them to transport a precious artifact known as the Eye of Shangri-La from the Shanghai Museum in China. Rick and Evelyn are hesitant at first, but the idea of another adventure is clearly tempting. They use Evelyn's brother, who is living in China, as a convenient reason to accept the trip. When they arrive in Shanghai, they head to a nightclub owned by Evelyn's brother, Jonathan Carnahan, where the next stage of their adventure begins. A short while later, Alex suddenly rushes out from the kitchen, with an furious cook storming after him. Rick quickly steps in to protect him, but the moment he gets a proper look at the man, the tension disappears. The angry chef turns out to be Mad Dog McGuire, someone Rick once served alongside back in Egypt. The two men recognize each other instantly, and their old friendship turns the heated moment into a cheerful reunion. When Rick and Evelyn finally try to talk to Alex, though, the mood shifts again. Alex keeps his guard up and refuses to open up to them. His frustration boils over, and he snaps at Rick, making it clear that he has no intention of going back to college. Before either of his parents can properly respond, he walks out of the club. Worried about what is happening between father and son, Evelyn takes Rick up to the rooftop so they can speak privately. She tells him that forcing Alex or judging him too harshly will only push him further away. What Alex needs, she says, is patience, understanding, and a father willing to meet him halfway. Rick listens, and together they agree that they need to try harder if they want to rebuild the bond with their son. The following day, General Yang discovers that Rick O'Connell now has the Eye of Shangri-La in his possession. At a military-style outpost in western China, Yang gathers his men and reveals the true purpose behind his plans. He wants to bring the Dragon Emperor back from the dead and use his return to restore China as a mighty empire under unstoppable power. That night, Alex takes his parents to see the excavated statue of the emperor. Rick is genuinely impressed by what his son has uncovered, and instead of making another sharp comment, he makes an honest effort to praise him. Alex accepts it, but only briefly, then leaves to look for Wilson. As he moves through the area, he notices someone shadowing him and quickly grows suspicious. He spots a figure hiding nearby and follows after them. At the same time, Professor Wilson pays a visit to the O'Connells and greets them warmly, acting like an old friend. Trusting him completely, Rick shows him the Eye of Shangri-La and even hands the priceless artifact over, believing Wilson is one of the few people who can be relied on. But that trust is destroyed almost immediately when General Yang enters the room. Wilson's friendly manner drops in an instant. He draws a gun and points it straight at Rick and Evelyn. Wilson then reveals the truth. General Yang had secretly been financing Alex's excavation from the beginning, not for history or science, but to locate the Dragon Emperor and bring him back to life. Rick and Evelyn attempt to fight back, but Wilson stops them cold by threatening to shoot Rick if they move. Meanwhile, Alex catches up with the figure who had been following him and realizes she is the same assassin who attacked him inside the tomb. From the second level, the two watch what is happening below. The woman finally introduces herself as Lin. Downstairs, Yang's soldiers force Evelyn to read and translate the inscription on the Eye of Shangri-La. When she does, the relic opens, revealing the sacred elixir hidden inside, the very substance needed to awaken the Emperor. Yang orders Wilson to kill Rick, but before Wilson can fire, Alex and Lin leap into action and save him. The O'Connells quickly turn the fight around and knock several of their enemies down, but in the chaos, the elixir spills onto the Emperor's statue. Lin rushes forward and drives her dagger into the heart of the figure, trying to destroy the Emperor before he can rise. But a terrible realization hits her almost immediately. The statue she stabbed is only a decoy. Across the chamber, the real stone body of the Dragon Emperor begins to stir. Rick, Evelyn, and the others open fire, sending bullets into the Stone Emperor, but nothing slows him down. Moments later, his ancient stone horses begin to breathe as well. Before the chariot can fully escape, Lin and Alex grab onto its underside and are dragged along as it bursts out of the building. The O'Connells and Jonathan Carnahan chase after them in a truck loaded with fireworks, tearing through the streets of Shanghai as the Emperor's chariot races ahead. Rick fires one of the rockets straight at the Emperor, but the Emperor dodges the attack and sends it flying into a tram instead, causing a violent explosion. Evelyn pushes the truck closer, giving Rick the chance to leap onto one of the Emperor's ancient horses. He cuts the horse free and struggles to control it, then calls for Alex to climb on behind him. But Alex, still stubborn and unwilling to accept help from his father, refuses. The chase becomes even more chaotic when the Emperor activates the fireworks in Evelyn's truck, while Rick's horse becomes harder and harder to handle. Lin and Alex try to attack the Emperor directly with the dagger, but General Yang, hiding inside the chariot, accidentally shoots Lin. Alex loses his grip before he can reach her and slips toward the back, barely managing to hang on. To his surprise, Lin reaches out to help him. She tells him the bullet missed, and Alex, relieved, accepts her hand with a smile. Yang's brief sense of relief does not last long. The Emperor forces the chariot off its path and sends it launching through the air. Then, with a display of supernatural power, he turns the walkway beneath them into ice. Lin and Alex are thrown off balance as the chase crashes into the middle of a Chinese festival, with Rick caught in the madness as well. Meanwhile, the fireworks inside Evelyn's truck keep detonating one after another. Evelyn and Jonathan are forced to jump out just in time before the entire vehicle explodes. With the Emperor gone, the group retreats to Jonathan's nightclub to regroup. There, Lin explains the truth about herself. She has been sworn to guard the Emperor's tomb and prevent his return. Alex takes her seriously, but Rick and Evelyn remain doubtful at first. Lin tells them that their only chance of stopping the Emperor is to reach the gateway to Shangri-La before he does. She also reveals a special dagger, the one weapon that can permanently kill him. Although the O'Connells still have questions, they agree to follow Lin's lead. Their search takes them into the Himalayas, where they board Mad Dog McGuire's helicopter and fly through violent storm clouds toward the mountains. After a dangerous landing that nearly sends them over a cliff, the group climbs higher into the frozen terrain, continuing their journey toward the hidden gateway. When McGuire warns the group that General Yang has reached the mountain, Rick and the others decide to stop for the night and set up camp. As everyone settles into the freezing surroundings, Evelyn begins noticing the quiet tension between Alex and Lin. From the way they look at each other, she suspects that her son may be developing feelings for the mysterious tomb guardian. A little later, Alex steps into their temporary tent and confronts Lin about what his mother has been suggesting. He insists that Evelyn has completely misunderstood the situation and firmly says that he does not feel anything for Lin. Lin responds with the same cold confidence, telling him that she has no feelings for him either. But despite what both of them claim out loud, the silence between them says something very different. There is clearly a growing attraction neither one is ready to admit. The next day, the group finally reaches the gateway to Shangri-La. Before them stands an ancient temple, with a shining golden tower rising from the center. But their arrival does not go unnoticed. As soon as General Yang's soldiers surround the temple and move into position, they open fire. Rick's team fights back, and the quiet mountain turns into a battlefield. Bullets tear through the air as both sides exchange fire. The situation becomes even worse when Yang's men bring out a bazooka and fire at the temple, damaging the ancient structure. As stone and debris begin falling around them, Rick and the others are forced to retreat deeper inside. While the battle rages, Jonathan tries to reach the explosives wrapped around the Golden Tower. His plan is to light the fuse and destroy the structure before the Emperor can use it to claim the full power of eternal life. But the gunfire becomes too intense. Jonathan is forced to dive away, dropping his lighter into the snow before he can set the explosives off. Outside the temple, Rick and Evelyn suddenly hear Lin shouting in a language they do not understand. Just as Yang's soldiers begin gaining the upper hand, 3 massive Yetis emerge from the snow and charge into the fight. The creatures rush to aid Lin and the O'Connells, turning the battle into complete chaos. Jonathan eventually spots his lighter buried in the snow and scrambles to recover it. This time, he manages to ignite the fuse. Meanwhile, the Yetis tear through many of Yang's troops while Rick and his team continue fighting alongside them. For a moment, it looks like the group may actually stop the Emperor's plan. But then, the Dragon Emperor arrives. With terrifying control over the mountain itself, he raises sharp spikes from the ground and shifts the entire battle in his favor. Using his power, he magically extinguishes the burning fuse before the explosives can go off. The Yetis, sensing the danger, are frightened away and retreat into the mountains. The Emperor then climbs the Golden Tower and places the Eye of Shangri-La at its peak. The artifact begins to glow, sending out a beam of light that reveals the hidden location of the pool of eternal life. Alex sees his chance and prepares to throw a stick of dynamite at the Emperor, but he fails to notice the Emperor's sword flying straight toward him. Rick reacts without hesitation. He shoves Alex out of the way, saving his son, but the blade strikes Rick instead and impales him. Alex's throw is ruined, and the dynamite lands off target. The explosion triggers a massive avalanche, sending a wall of snow crashing down the mountain toward them. Just before it hits, the Yetis return and shield the group from the full force of the impact. When everyone regains their senses, the entire area is buried beneath snow, ice, and fallen rocks. Rick is badly wounded and close to death, so the group has no choice but to hurry toward the pool of eternal life. They make their way through a hidden tunnel, searching desperately for a way to save him. Inside, they come face to face with Ziyuan, who is revealed to be Lin's mother. Alex quickly realizes that both Lin and Ziyuan are immortal. Ziyuan welcomes the group and offers them shelter. More importantly, she uses the power of Shangri-La to heal Rick, pulling him back from the edge of death. Afterward, Ziyuan explains her past. She and Lin have spent generations protecting the Emperor's tomb and making sure he never rises again. She reveals that after the Emperor stabbed her long ago, she was rescued by the Yetis and brought to Shangri-La, where she survived and began her immortal life. While Rick rests and recovers, Alex finally opens up to Lin. He admits that his feelings for her are real. Lin clearly feels something for him too, but she refuses to accept it. She tells Alex that she does not want to repeat her mother's painful story. If she loves him, she will eventually have to watch him grow old and die, while she continues living forever. She does not want to spend centuries grieving him the way Ziyuan has mourned General Ming. Before they can say anything more, Jonathan interrupts and tells them Rick has woken up. Alex immediately goes to see his father, and for the first time in a long while, the wall between them starts to fall. Seeing Rick alive and fully recovered changes something in him. Alex drops the distant attitude and admits how much he truly cares about his father. He apologizes for the way he has acted over the years and tells Rick, sincerely, that he loves him. Rick is caught off guard by Alex's honesty, but instead of brushing it aside, he accepts his own mistakes too. He admits that he has not been the father Alex needed him to be. In that moment, both father and son put their pride aside, and their damaged relationship finally begins to heal. Ziyuan then speaks gently with Lin. As a mother, she tells her that she intends to free her from the curse of immortality, allowing Lin to live a normal human life with Alex if that is what she chooses. For a brief moment, it seems as though everyone may finally have a chance at peace. But that moment is shattered when the Dragon Emperor attacks from the entrance, blasting into the chamber and separating Lin from Ziyuan. With ruthless precision, he uses his power to pin both women down. Then he takes the magical dagger, the one weapon capable of destroying him. After seizing his only weakness, the Emperor enters the pool of eternal life. The water begins to react around him, and his body transforms into a monstrous three-headed dragon. When the O'Connells emerge and witness his new form, the dragon unleashes a scorching blast of fire, lighting up the entire cavern with terrifying force. Fueled by centuries of rage and a burning desire to punish Ziyuan, the Dragon Emperor takes Lin hostage and heads back toward Ningxia province with General Yang at his side. Rick and the others are not far behind. Using Maguire's helicopter, they chase after the Emperor, knowing that if he reaches his army, the world may not get another chance to stop him. When the Emperor arrives in Ningxia, he shifts out of his dragon form and becomes human again. Standing before his ancient soldiers, he uses his revived power to awaken his massive army from stone. One by one, the warriors begin to come alive. With General Yang's men also gathered around him, the Emperor commands both forces like a conqueror preparing to reclaim the world. His ambition is no longer hidden. He intends to march again, and this time, he wants the entire world under his rule. Rick and his group watch from a distance, staying low behind large rocks while the enemy forces assemble. At the same time, Ziyuan rushes toward a hidden underground passage near the Great Wall. She knows that the Emperor's army can only be challenged by another army, so she prepares to call upon the dead warriors who once fought against him. In return for their help, she chants an ancient spell, one powerful enough to awaken the fallen soldiers from beneath the earth. But the magic comes with a heavy price. By completing the incantation, both she and Lin lose the immortality that has kept them alive for generations. Moments later, the bones of the dead begin to rise. Skeletal warriors pull themselves from the ground and charge into the battlefield. The Emperor's living army and the resurrected dead collide in a massive war, turning the desert into complete chaos. While the battle erupts below, Rick notices that Alex has already made a move of his own. Disguised among Yang's soldiers, Alex slips through enemy lines and reaches Lin. Without drawing attention to himself, he frees her from captivity, giving her the chance to rejoin the fight. As the war rages across the battlefield, the Emperor approaches Ziyuan, who stands waiting for him on a raised plateau. Their confrontation has been thousands of years in the making, and neither one hesitates. They clash in a fierce duel, trading strikes with all the hatred and pain of their shared past. Ziyuan fights bravely, but the Emperor eventually overpowers her. He tears the sword from her hand and holds her at blade point. But Ziyuan sees something he does not. The stolen dagger, the only weapon that can kill him, is tucked into his baldric. Realizing this may be her only chance, she makes a desperate choice. She pushes herself forward onto his sword, using the wound to get close enough to reach the dagger. Quietly, she pulls it free without him noticing. The Emperor believes he has defeated her. He yanks his sword back, and Ziyuan falls from the cliff. Before anyone can recover, the Emperor spots aircraft approaching through the sky. Seeing reinforcements closing in, he transforms into a giant beast and destroys one of the planes with terrifying ease. Rick and the others regroup as the Emperor begins moving toward the underground tunnel. If he reaches it, he can fully restore his army and make them unstoppable. But before they can chase after him, they find Ziyuan weakly crawling through the battlefield. Lin rushes to her mother's side. With her final strength, Ziyuan hands the dagger to Lin. Then, now mortal at last, she dies in her daughter's arms. Lin is devastated, holding her mother as the battle continues around her. But there is no time to grieve for long. Alex and Rick spot the Emperor's sword and realize he is still trying to complete his plan. They immediately go after him. Just before the Emperor can revive the rest of his army, Alex throws himself into the fight and interrupts him. Enraged, the Emperor transforms again into a monstrous beast. Alex is quickly overpowered and thrown across the chamber, but Rick attacks from behind and drives the dagger into the creature. For a brief second, it seems like the blow may end him, but the strike misses the Emperor's heart, leaving him still alive and more dangerous than ever. The Emperor retaliates by hurling his sword toward Rick, nearly killing him. In the chaos, the dagger smashes against the wall and breaks apart, its shattered pieces scattering across the ground just inches from Rick. Meanwhile, Lin and Evelyn face General Yang. Even after surviving Jonathan's bombing attack, Yang continues fighting with brutal determination. But the two women refuse to let him escape. Working together, they overpower him, and Yang is finally swallowed by the collapsing battlefield around them. At the same time, Rick and the Emperor are locked in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. The Emperor hits hard, and Rick takes blow after blow, struggling to stay on his feet. While the fight continues, Alex notices one of the broken pieces of the dagger nearby. Thinking quickly, he grabs it and draws a signal in the sand for his father. Rick sees the mark after another painful exchange and understands exactly what Alex is trying to tell him. He grabs the second broken piece of the dagger and waits for the right moment. Then, as father and son move together, Rick drives his fragment straight into the Emperor's heart from the front, while Alex leaps in from behind and stabs him with the other piece. This time, the strike works. The Dragon Emperor's brief return to life ends in an instant. His body breaks apart, and with him gone, his army collapses as well. The threat that began thousands of years earlier is finally destroyed. After surviving an adventure unlike anything they expected, the group returns to Shanghai. The film ends on a lighter, warmer note, with Rick and Evelyn dancing together while Alex dances with Lin. Both couples hold each other happily as the night continues, finally able to enjoy peace after another impossible journey. There are some movie franchises where even the weaker entries still have a little bit of leftover charm. You know, the kind of film where you can see the cracks, you know the story is messy, you know half of it makes no sense, but somehow, because you liked the earlier movies, you still give it a chance. And that is kind of the situation with the Presh BDF. The Mummy, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor. Because look, The first two Mummy movies were never exactly serious cinema. Nobody was watching Brendan Fraser fight ancient curses and undead warriors expecting deep historical accuracy or some perfectly crafted prestige drama. Those movies were loud, goofy, ridiculous, and proudly built like old-school adventure serials. But they had something. They had rhythm. They had personality. They had that mix of danger, comedy, romance, and pulpy adventure that made the whole thing feel alive. This third film wants to bring that feeling back. It really does. You can see it trying. It has another ancient evil. It has another cursed army. It has another race against time. It brings Rick O'Connell back, gives him a grown son, moves the adventure to China, throws in Jet Li, Michelle Yeoh, magical relics, giant battles, and enough CGI to make the screen feel permanently crowded. On paper, that should be exciting, at least a little. But the problem is, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor doesn't feel like the franchise evolving. It feels more like the franchise being dragged out for one more round, hoping the audience will remember how much fun they had before and just go along with it. And, for a while, maybe you do go along with it. There is still some adventure energy here. Brendan Fraser is still Brendan Fraser. The movie is colorful, expensive-looking, and constantly moving. It is not one of those sequels where absolutely nothing happens. If anything, too much is happening all the time. But very quickly, you start to feel what is missing. The spark is not the same. The humor does not land the same way. The characters do not bounce off each other with the same ease. The story feels familiar, but not in a comforting way. More like someone took the basic shape of a Mummy movie, changed the mythology, changed the location, replaced a key cast member, added bigger visual effects, and assumed that would be enough. And honestly, that is why this one is usually remembered as the weakest chapter of the trilogy. Not because it is impossible to watch. It is watchable. There are moments where the movie almost works as simple popcorn entertainment. But compared to the first film, especially, it feels hollow. The original Mummy had this messy but charming sense of discovery. It felt like an adventure that accidentally became more fun than it had any right to be. This one feels much more calculated. Louder, bigger, busier, but somehow less exciting. That is the strange thing about this movie. It has more spectacle, but less magic. It has a bigger villain, but less tension. It has more action, but less fun. And by the time you realize that, the movie has already shown you exactly what kind of sequel it is going to be. A massive, noisy, expensive continuation that keeps borrowing the surface of the old formula, but never really recaptures the soul underneath it. Part of the reason Tomb of the Dragon Emperor feels so disappointing is because the first two Mummy films had already built up a very specific kind of goodwill. And honestly, it was not the kind of goodwill that comes from being perfect. The first Mummy was never some flawless adventure masterpiece. The second one had plenty of ridiculous stuff too. These movies were always silly. They were always exaggerated. They were full of ancient curses, impossible escapes, over-the-top villains, cheesy jokes, and characters surviving things that should have absolutely ended the movie in 10 minutes. But that was part of the appeal. They had this Saturday afternoon adventure feeling, like something you would randomly catch on TV and then accidentally watch until the end. You did not need to be in a serious mood for them. You did not need to analyze every plot turn. You just needed Brendan Fraser running around with a gun, Rachel Weisz getting pulled into some cursed disaster, John Hannah panicking in the background, and a supernatural threat big enough to keep the whole thing moving. That formula worked because it had charm. Even when the movies were dumb, they were fun dumb. There is a difference. Fun dumb knows what it is. Fun dumb has energy. Fun dumb makes you forgive the nonsense because the characters are enjoyable and the adventure has momentum. And that is where this third film runs into trouble. Because Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is also dumb, but it is not always fun dumb. Sometimes it just feels loud. Sometimes it feels like the movie remembers the ingredients of the earlier films, but not the flavor. It has the ancient curse. It has the villain coming back from the dead. It has the big final battle. It has the one-liners. It has the family adventure setup. But somehow, the feeling is different. With the first two films, even when things got ridiculous, there was still this playful confidence underneath everything. They had a messy, pulpy rhythm that made the nonsense feel alive. This one often feels like it is trying to manufacture that same energy by simply adding more stuff. More CGI, more creatures, more explosions, more mythology, more action. But more does not automatically mean more fun. And I think that is why nostalgia actually works against this movie. If you have affection for the earlier Mummy films, you do not just remember the plot, you remember the vibe, you remember the chemistry, you remember how easy those movies were to sit through, even when they were being completely absurd. This third entry brings back some familiar names and tries to give you that same comfort, but it never fully earns it. It is like revisiting an old place from childhood and realizing the building is technically still there, but the atmosphere is gone. The walls are familiar, the sign is familiar, but something feels off. That does not mean there is no entertainment here. There is. In small bursts, the movie can still be enjoyable. If it is on TV and you are not expecting too much, you might let it play. You might even have a decent time with certain scenes. But compared to the memory of what this franchise used to feel like, it comes up short. The first two films were not intelligent, but they were lively. This one is not intelligent either. The difference is, it keeps forgetting to be lively. By the time Tomb of the Dragon Emperor arrives, you can feel the franchise starting to run on fumes. Not completely dead, not totally out of ideas, but definitely at that point where the machine is still moving, while the excitement behind it has started to fade. And that is a dangerous place for an adventure series to be, because these movies depend so much on momentum. They need to feel like someone is excited to tell the next story. Here, it often feels more like someone just wanted another Mummy movie. And there is a difference. The first film had that surprise factor. It came out with this mix of horror, adventure, comedy, romance, and old-fashioned monster movie energy, and somehow all of it clicked. The second film was already more exaggerated, more crowded, more obviously sequel-shaped, but it still had enough of the original cast chemistry and pulpy energy to keep it moving. This third one feels different. It feels like the studio looked at the brand name, looked at the old formula, and thought, okay, we can do this again. Change the country, change the Mummy, add a bigger army, add more CGI, bring Brendan Fraser back, put some famous martial arts stars in there. That should work. And technically, yes, that is a movie. But it does not feel like a movie that needed to exist. That is the problem. There is a strange emptiness behind so much of it. The film is busy, but not inspired. Expensive, but not imaginative enough. It keeps throwing things at the screen, almost like it is afraid that if it slows down for even a second, the audience will notice how thin everything is underneath. And to be fair, this is not the first franchise sequel to feel like that. Hollywood has always done this. If something works once, they try it again. If it works twice, they stretch it further. That is not automatically a bad thing. A sequel can absolutely justify itself if it finds a new angle, deepens the characters, or brings a fresh energy to the same world. But Tomb of the Dragon Emperor never really finds that reason. It has a new mythology, but not a new spirit. It has a new villain, but not a new emotional hook. It has a new generation with Alex, but not a strong enough story to make that matter. So instead of feeling like the next chapter, it starts to feel like product. Big, loud, polished product, but product all the same. The kind of sequel that exists because the name still has value, because audiences remember the earlier films, because there is still some money left in the brand. And you can sense that while watching it. You are not pulled into the adventure as much as you are reminded of a better version of this formula. Every chase, every relic, every ancient curse, every goofy line feels like it is trying to trigger your memory of the earlier movies. But nostalgia can only carry a film so far. At some point, the movie itself has to take over. This one rarely does. It gives you the shape of a Mummy film without the same pulse. It has the noise, the monsters, the running, the battles, the magical artifact, all of it. But underneath, there is that unmistakable feeling of a franchise being kept alive because it can be, not because anyone found a truly exciting reason to bring it back. The biggest issue with Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is not just that the story is messy, or that the CGI gets out of hand, or even that Rachel Weisz is gone. Those things matter, obviously. But the real problem is simpler than that. The movie does not have the same heart. And with a franchise like The Mummy, heart is kind of everything. Because when you strip these movies down, the plots are completely ridiculous. Ancient curses, magical books, undead armies, secret tombs, heroes surviving impossible disasters every 10 minutes. None of this works if the audience is only thinking logically. The reason the earlier films worked was because they had a human center. Rick and Evelyn were fun together. Jonathan was annoying, sure, but in a way that still fit the group. The danger was exaggerated, but the characters had enough warmth and personality that you wanted to follow them through the chaos. Even when the movie got stupid, it still felt like everybody was inside the same adventure. This third film does not have that same glue. It has characters standing where the old characters should be. It has jokes placed where the old jokes would go. It has action scenes arriving where the old action scenes would usually arrive. But the emotional rhythm feels off. The movie keeps moving, but it does not feel like it is breathing. That is why the whole thing comes across colder than it probably should. There is supposed to be a sense of reunion here. Rick and Evelyn are older. Their son is grown. The family is getting pulled back into danger one more time. On paper, that should give the movie a nice emotional layer. Maybe a little reflection on aging. Maybe some tension between adventure and domestic life. Maybe even a passing of the torch feeling with Alex. But the film never really earns any of that. It introduces those ideas, brushes past them, and then rushes toward the next chase or explosion. The family dynamic is there, but it feels more like a requirement than a real emotional engine. Rick and Evelyn do not have the same spark. Alex does not bring enough personality to reshape the story around him. Jonathan is still hanging around, but even his comic energy feels more mechanical than natural. So you end up with a movie that is technically packed with adventure but emotionally kind of empty. And that is a weird thing to say about a film this loud, because Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is never quiet. It is always throwing something at you. A tomb, a curse, a fight, a monster, a magical object, a massive army, a dragon, yetis, explosions, more explosions. But noise is not the same thing as energy. Scale is not the same thing as excitement. And spectacle is not the same thing as heart. The earlier Mummy movies had a scrappy charm to them. They felt like big-budget adventures, but they also had this loose, goofy, slightly reckless personality. This one feels more controlled and more manufactured, which is ironic because it is also messier in so many ways. It is bigger but less alive. That is what makes it disappointing. Not that it fails to be serious, because this franchise was never built on seriousness. It fails because it loses that warm, pulpy sense of fun that made the nonsense easy to forgive. And once that heart is gone, all the ancient armies in the world cannot bring it back. One of the most obvious changes in Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is that the franchise finally leaves Egypt behind. And honestly, that idea is not bad. After 2 movies built around Egyptian curses, ancient tombs, Imhotep, scarabs, sandstorms, and all that familiar desert mythology, moving the story to China could have been a smart way to refresh the series. It gives the movie a different historical texture, different legends, different visuals, different kinds of supernatural danger. So instead of another Egyptian priest coming back from the dead, we get Emperor Han, we get the Terracotta Army, we get Shangri-La, we get the Himalayas. We get Chinese sorcery, immortality, ancient betrayal, and a whole new mythological playground for the O'Connells to stumble into. On paper, that sounds like exactly the kind of change a third movie needs, because by this point, doing another Egyptian mummy story probably would have felt too safe. The franchise needed some new blood. Or, well, new dust, I guess, and at first, the Chinese setting does give the film a slightly different flavor. There is something visually interesting about moving from the sandy tombs of the first 2 films into a world of imperial armies, snowy mountains, post-war Shanghai, and ancient stone warriors waiting to be awakened. The movie has scale, it has color, it has places to go. But the more it goes on, the more you realize the location change is mostly surface level. The film changes the mythology, but it does not really change the storytelling. That is where the disappointment starts creeping in. Because instead of fully embracing the richness of this new setting, the movie mostly uses China as a fresh backdrop for the same old formula. Ancient ruler gets cursed. Ancient ruler comes back. Magical object becomes important. Heroes run from place to place. Massive undead army shows up. Big final battle. End of the world, again. It is Egypt swapped for China, but the structure underneath barely moves. And that is frustrating because the ingredients here could have created something more distinctive. The Terracotta Army alone is such a strong visual idea. A cursed emperor tied to immortality and conquest could have worked. Michelle Yeoh as a powerful sorceress, Jet Li as an ancient ruler, that should not feel ordinary. But somehow, the movie makes a lot of these elements feel weirdly generic. The Chinese mythology becomes less of a world to explore and more of a checklist. Shangri-La is there, the Himalayas are there, the army is there, the curse is there. But the film rarely slows down enough to make any of it feel mysterious, dangerous, or emotionally important. It just keeps pushing forward like it is afraid the audience will lose interest unless something explodes every few minutes. And that is the strange contradiction of this sequel. It makes a huge geographical and mythological shift, but still feels trapped in the same old habits. You can see the movie trying to become bigger than the earlier films. It wants to expand the franchise beyond Egypt and prove that this series can survive in a different corner of ancient history. But instead of feeling like a bold reinvention, it often feels like a costume change. The adventure has moved. The soul has not followed. The frustrating thing about Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is that the new setting is genuinely interesting. That is what makes the disappointment a little sharper. Because this is not a sequel that had nothing to work with. It had China. It had the Terracotta Army. It had an emperor chasing immortality. It had ancient magic, hidden tombs, mountain temples, Shangri-La, and this whole contrast between post-war modern China and a supernatural past that refuses to stay buried. That is a strong foundation for an adventure movie. You could build something really exciting from that, something with a different rhythm from the first two films, something that does not just copy the old Egyptian curse formula, but actually uses Chinese mythology and history to give the franchise a new personality. And every now and then you can almost see the movie reaching for that. There are shots and ideas that do have a certain appeal. The Terracotta Army coming into the story is visually strong. The Emperor's connection to immortality gives the villain a clear mythic angle. The scenery and production design sometimes make the movie feel bigger than a simple franchise sequel. Even the idea of Rick and his family being dropped into a completely different cultural and supernatural world could have created a nice fish-out-of-water adventure, but the film rarely lets those ideas breathe. Instead of making the setting feel like a world, it often treats it like decoration. China becomes a backdrop for chases, Shangri-La becomes a destination, the Terracotta Army becomes a CGI army. The mythology becomes a set of plot devices that exist mainly to move the characters from one action scene to the next, and that is where the movie starts to feel generic. It is not that every adventure film needs to be historically deep or academically accurate. This is The Mummy, not a documentary. Nobody is asking for a lecture. But even pulpy adventure needs atmosphere. It needs mystery. It needs that feeling that the characters have stumbled into something ancient and dangerous, something larger than themselves. The first film understood that better. Even when it was being goofy, it let the tombs feel cursed. It let Imhotep feel like a legend returning to life. It let the ancient world have some weight. Here, the movie introduces all these potentially rich elements and then keeps rushing past them. A magical relic appears, and before you can really care, the film is already moving. A hidden place is revealed, and before it becomes mysterious, the next set piece takes over. The Emperor's army rises. But instead of feeling terrifying or awe-inspiring, it often feels like the movie is showing off the size of its effects budget. That is the problem with surface-level mythology. It looks impressive for a moment, but it does not stay with you. And with a setting this full of possibilities, that feels like a missed opportunity. The movie could have used Chinese legend to reinvent the franchise. It could have given the third film its own identity, its own mood, its own sense of danger. Instead, it gives us a lot of beautiful pieces arranged in a very familiar pattern. So while the film looks different from the first two, it does not always feel different in the way that matters. The sand has been replaced by snow, stone, temples, and imperial armies, but the storytelling underneath remains strangely ordinary. And that is why the setting feels less like a bold new chapter and more like an expensive backdrop waiting for a better movie. The story of Tomb of the Dragon Emperor begins with a very familiar idea. The O'Connells are pulled out of normal life and dragged back into another ancient supernatural disaster. At this point, Rick and Evelyn are no longer supposed to be the same reckless adventurers we met in the earlier films. They are older now. They have moved past the tomb-raiding, monster-fighting phase of their lives, or at least they are trying to. Rick is settled into retirement, Evelyn is living a quieter life, and both of them seem caught in that awkward place where peace should feel satisfying, but instead it mostly feels boring. Which is a decent starting point, honestly. There is something fun about the idea of these two people who once fought mummies and saved the world now struggling with ordinary domestic life. You can feel the movie trying to set up that classic one last adventure energy. Rick and Evelyn think their wild days are behind them, but of course, in a franchise like this, ancient evil does not care about retirement. So they are asked to take the Eye of Shangri-La back to China, and naturally, that simple mission turns out to be anything but simple. Meanwhile, their son Alex has been busy doing exactly what you would expect the child of Rick and Evelyn O'Connell to do, digging up something he absolutely should not be digging up. He discovers the tomb of Emperor Han, an ancient ruler who was cursed centuries earlier along with his army. And once that tomb is opened, the movie starts putting the old pieces back on the board: a cursed emperor, a magical relic, a hidden path to immortality, a villainous general who wants to resurrect a dead ruler for power, a family of adventurers who should know better by now but somehow end up in the middle of it anyway. The basic setup is pure mummy formula, just with a new location and a new mythological skin. Instead of Egypt, we are in China. Instead of Imhotep, we have Emperor Han. Instead of the old desert adventure mood, the film pushes toward Shanghai, the Himalayas, Shangri-La, and the Terracotta Army. And again, none of this is a bad idea by itself. The premise has enough material for a fun sequel. Rick and Evelyn being forced back into action could have worked. Alex discovering the tomb could have been a strong way to bring in the next generation. General Yang trying to use the Emperor for his own ambitions gives the story a clear external threat. And the Eye of Shangri-La gives everyone a simple object to chase, which is basically adventure movie fuel. But the issue is that the film treats the setup more like a checklist than a story with real momentum. It introduces Rick and Evelyn's retirement but does not do much with it. It introduces Alex as the son stepping into the family legacy, but the emotional weight of that idea feels thin. It introduces the Emperor's curse, the sorceress, the army, the relic, the betrayal, the race to Shangri-La, and yet so much of it feels functional. Like the movie is saying, here is the ancient backstory, here is the object, here is the villain, here is the chase. Let's go. And sometimes that can work in a pulpy adventure movie. You do not always need a complicated plot. In fact, too much plot can slow these films down, but what you do need is a reason to care beyond the mechanics. That is where this setup struggles. The O'Connells return, but the reunion does not feel as exciting as it should. The ancient evil rises, but the threat does not feel as gripping as it should. The family dynamic is placed at the center, but the movie never quite makes it feel personal enough, so the story gets moving, yes. It has shape, it has stakes, it has all the basic ingredients you expect from this franchise, but from the beginning, there is this slight emptiness underneath it. You can see where the adventure is supposed to be, you can see the outline of a fun third chapter, but the movie never fully turns that outline into something alive. Once the movie finishes setting up the adventure, the biggest problem becomes pretty hard to ignore. The plot is incredibly thin. And I do not mean thin in the simple adventure movie way. A movie like this does not need some complicated political thriller structure. It does not need 10 layers of mystery or a plot that demands a notebook. Sometimes, for this kind of film, simple is better. Ancient evil wakes up, heroes have to stop it, everybody runs around until the final battle. Fine, that can work. But Tomb of the Dragon Emperor does not just have a simple plot. It has a plot that keeps feeling like it is making things up whenever it needs to move forward. That is where the frustration comes in. So much of the story depends on random magical rules, convenient objects, sudden explanations, and characters just accepting nonsense because the movie needs them to get to the next set piece. The Eye of Shangri-La matters because the movie says it matters. The Emperor needs this, then he needs that. Then there is a dagger, then there is a wall, then there is immortality, then there are armies, then there are powers that seem to shift depending on the scene. At some point, you stop asking how any of it works, not because the movie has earned your trust, because it clearly does not care. And again, yes, this franchise has always been ridiculous. The first two films were full of supernatural logic that would collapse if you stared at it for too long. But they had enough pace, charm, and character energy to keep you from picking at every little detail. The nonsense felt like part of the fun. Here, the nonsense feels lazier. There are moments where you can almost hear the script saying, "Don't worry about it, just look at the action." And sometimes that works for a few minutes. A chase starts, something explodes, the characters yell, and the movie throws enough movement at you to distract from the fact that the story underneath is barely holding together. But the distraction never lasts. the plot holes keep piling up. Characters know things because they need to know them. Ancient rules appear exactly when the scene requires them. Problems are solved by convenient explanations that do not feel properly planted. And some of the stranger elements, like the Yeti suddenly entering the movie, feel less like inspired pulp adventure and more like someone tossed another idea into the script because the film needed a new burst of weirdness. That is the difference between imaginative chaos and careless plotting. Imaginative chaos still feels designed. It may be wild, but it has rhythm. It has personality. It makes you feel like the movie knows exactly how silly it is and is having fun with that silliness. Careless plotting just feels random, and this movie drifts into that territory too often. The Emperor's plan is supposed to feel massive and dangerous, but because the rules around him are so loose, the threat becomes strangely abstract. He wants power. He wants immortality. He wants his army. He wants to conquer, sure. But the story does not build those ideas with enough weight. It just keeps announcing the next thing he needs, and the heroes keep reacting. That makes the adventure feel mechanical. Not impossible to follow, exactly. You can understand the broad shape of it. Bad Emperor returns. Family must stop him. That part is clear enough. But the details are so flimsy that the journey loses impact. Instead of feeling swept up in a supernatural mystery, you feel like you are being pulled from one noisy checkpoint to another. And after a while, the movie starts to feel less like an adventure and more like a chain of excuses. An excuse for a chase. An excuse for a joke. An excuse for a CGI creature. An excuse for a giant battle. There is still entertainment in pieces, but the story never becomes strong enough to hold those pieces together. It keeps moving, but it does not build. It keeps adding, but it does not deepen. So yes, the plot is dumb, but for a mummy movie, that alone would not be fatal. The real issue is that it is dumb without enough elegance, charm, or confidence to make the stupidity enjoyable. The biggest issue with Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is not that it follows a formula. Formula is not automatically a bad thing. Honestly, most adventure movies are built from familiar pieces. You have the ancient legend, the hidden tomb, the cursed object, the villain who wants power, the heroes who accidentally get involved, and then the whole thing turns into a race against time. That structure has worked for decades. It is basically the engine behind half of the genre. The problem here is that the movie does not just use the formula. It leans on it so heavily that you can feel the gears turning. There is a strange sense that the script took the basic shape of the earlier mummy films and simply changed the decoration. Egypt becomes China. Imhotep becomes Emperor Han. The desert becomes the Himalayas. Ancient Egyptian curses become Chinese sorcery. The undead army becomes the terracotta army. And just like that, we are supposed to feel like the franchise has been refreshed. But it has not, really. Because underneath all those changes, the movie is still moving through the same old motions. Ancient villain wakes up. Ancient villain wants immortality and world domination. The O'Connells have to stop him. A magical object points the way. There is a chase, then another chase, then a big supernatural battle at the end. You can almost predict the rhythm before it happens, and that takes away a lot of the fun. The first Mummy worked partly because it felt like it was rediscovering that old adventure movie language with a playful modern energy. It borrowed from classic serials and monster movies, but it had enough personality to make the borrowing feel affectionate rather than lazy. It knew it was ridiculous, but it had charm in the way it moved. This third film feels more like it is copying the copy. It is not just inspired by the earlier adventure style. It is imitating the previous Mummy movies, while those movies were already imitating older adventure films. So the whole thing starts to feel one step removed from anything fresh. And that is why the Chinese setting becomes such a missed opportunity. Because a new location should have changed the shape of the movie more than it does. It should have opened the door to a different kind of mystery, a different kind of threat, maybe even a different kind of emotional journey for the characters. Instead, the film mostly uses it to repaint the same structure. The names are different, the costumes are different, the mythology is different, but the movie's instincts are exactly the same. There is also this habit of throwing in elements that feel like they belong to other films. At times, it feels like an Indiana Jones imitation. Then suddenly, it wants the scale of a fantasy war movie. Then it wants mystical martial arts energy. Then it wants family comedy. Then it wants a giant CGI army crashing into another giant CGI army. Individually, some of those pieces could be fun. Together, They make the movie feel less like a confident adventure and more like a collection of things the filmmakers assumed audiences liked. That is the difference between a film having influences and a film feeling recycled. Influence gives a movie flavor. Recycling gives it déjà vu. And Tomb of the Dragon Emperor has a lot of déjà vu. Even the emotional beats feel familiar. Rick is back in reluctant hero mode. Evelyn is pulled into another ancient mess. Jonathan is there for comic relief. The younger generation gets involved. The villain rises. The world is in danger. The heroes bicker, run, fight, and survive impossible odds. It is all there, but it rarely feels newly imagined. The movie has the shape of a big adventure, but not the surprise of one. It keeps reaching for the feeling of the earlier films without understanding that the charm did not come from the checklist. It came from the way those pieces clicked together. Here, the pieces are assembled. They just do not click. One of the strangest things about Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is how often it reminds you of other movies, and not always in a good way. Now, to be fair, the Mummy franchise has always lived in the shadow of Indiana Jones. That was never exactly hidden. The whole appeal of the first film was that old-school adventure feeling. Dusty tombs, ancient curses, lost cities, arrogant villains, impossible escapes, and a hero who looks like he is making half of it up as he goes along. But the first Mummy had enough personality to survive those comparisons. It felt inspired by that kind of adventure cinema, not trapped underneath it. It had its own rhythm, its own monster movie flavor, and most importantly, its own character chemistry. So even if you could see the influences, you were not sitting there constantly thinking about the better movies it reminded you of. With Tomb of the Dragon Emperor, that becomes harder to ignore. There are moments where the movie feels like a weaker Indiana Jones adventure. Then there are moments where it almost feels like National Treasure, except without the clever historical puzzle box energy. Then, when the giant armies start gathering and the fantasy scale gets bigger, you can feel the movie reaching for something closer to Lord of the Rings or other massive battle-driven fantasy films. And that is where it gets messy, because this franchise was never really built for that kind of epic seriousness. It worked best when it was pulpy, a little spooky, a little romantic, and just self-aware enough to laugh at itself. But here, the movie keeps drifting into borrowed shapes. A relic chase here, a mystical warrior legend there, a massive army battle at the end, a villain who wants to dominate the world, heroes racing across exotic locations while the script throws one supernatural rule after another at them. It is familiar, but not in a satisfying way. At times, it almost feels like the movie is trying to prove it can compete with every other adventure blockbuster at once. It wants the globe-trotting energy of Indiana Jones. It wants the artifact-hunting momentum of National Treasure. It wants the fantasy war scale of Lord of the Rings. It wants martial arts mythology. It wants family comedy. It wants horror imagery. It wants creatures, curses, dragons, armies, and magical immortality. That sounds huge, but huge is not the same as distinctive. The more the film pulls from other genres and other movies, the less clear its own identity becomes. Instead of feeling like a confident Mummy sequel, it starts to feel like a remix of things audiences have already seen done better elsewhere. And this is especially noticeable because the original films were already borrowing from classic adventure cinema. So by the third movie, it feels like we are watching a copy of a copy. The adventure beats are there, the relics are there, the chases are there, but the spark of discovery is mostly gone. The movie is not completely empty of fun. Some of those borrowed pieces do create moments of entertainment. A chase can still be exciting for a few seconds. A tomb can still look cool. A massive army can still make the screen feel big. But when the movie keeps reminding you of better, sharper, more memorable films, it becomes harder to stay invested in this one. That is the risk with this kind of sequel. Influences are fine. Every adventure film has them. But when the influences become more interesting than the movie itself, you have a problem. And Tomb of the Dragon Emperor spends too much of its runtime feeling like it is chasing the ghosts of other blockbusters, instead of becoming the bold third Mummy film it could have been. A big reason Tomb of the Dragon Emperor feels so mechanical is the way the script keeps explaining itself. Not in a clever way. Not in a way that builds mystery. More like the movie is worried we might miss something, so it has a character say the obvious thing out loud every few minutes, and once you notice it, it becomes hard to ignore. Something dramatic happens, and instead of letting the moment play visually, someone basically announces what is happening. The Emperor is gaining his power back, so a character says that he is gaining his power back. An avalanche starts, and the movie still feels the need to point out the avalanche. A magical rule appears, and someone quickly explains it just before it becomes important. It is not storytelling, it is labeling. And that kind of writing makes the adventure feel flat, because the audience is not discovering anything. We are being dragged from explanation to explanation, with action scenes acting like noise between chunks of exposition. The structure becomes very predictable after a while. The movie gives you a little plot, then an action scene, then a joke. Then someone explains the next magical object or ancient rule, then another chase, then another joke, then another supernatural reveal. And on it goes. There is not much flow to it. It feels assembled rather than told. That is especially frustrating because this type of movie should have a sense of momentum. A good adventure script can be ridiculous and still feel smooth. It can move quickly without feeling rushed. It can introduce mythology without making every scene sound like a tour guide explaining the attraction. Here, the writing often feels too functional. Characters say what the plot needs them to say. Scenes exist to push the heroes toward the next location. Emotional conflicts appear, but they rarely develop with any real patience. The story does not build naturally from one choice to the next. It mostly jumps from set piece to set piece, then uses dialogue to patch the gaps. And that is where the script starts to feel lazy. Not because it is simple. Simple is fine. But because it keeps taking shortcuts. Instead of planting ideas early and paying them off later, it introduces things right when they are needed. Instead of letting character moments reveal personality, it gives them obvious lines. Instead of creating tension through mystery, it keeps stopping to clarify the rules of the current problem. The result is a movie that rarely trusts the audience, or maybe worse, it rarely trusts itself. It does not have the confidence to let the visuals carry the story. It does not have the patience to let the mythology feel ancient and strange. It does not have the wit to make the exposition entertaining, so everything becomes a little too direct, a little too obvious, a little too loud, and that really hurts the sense of adventure. Because adventure is not just movement, it is curiosity. It is the feeling that the characters are stepping into something unknown and we are uncovering it with them. But when every mystery gets flattened into a quick explanation, the world stops feeling mysterious. It just becomes plot machinery. You can see the bones of a fun story here. Cursed Emperor, magical relic, hidden city, family of adventurers, undead army. Those are strong ingredients, but the script never shapes them with enough elegance. It keeps pushing information at us instead of turning that information into suspense, wonder, or emotional stakes. So even when the movie is racing forward, the writing makes it feel strangely heavy. Not because there is too much story, because there is too little storytelling. The comedy in Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is one of those things that should have been easy for the movie, at least in theory. Because this franchise was never built on serious, stone-faced adventure. The first two films worked partly because they were willing to be goofy. Rick could throw out a sarcastic line in the middle of danger. Jonathan could panic his way through a scene. Evelyn could bring this slightly chaotic intelligence into the madness. The humor helped balance the horror and the action. So when this third movie tries to be funny, it is not doing something out of place. The problem is the jokes do not feel alive anymore. A lot of the dialogue lands with this strange stiffness, like the movie knows a joke is supposed to go there, so it drops one in and hopes the audience remembers laughing at this kind of thing before. But the timing is off, the setup is weak, the lines feel too obvious. And instead of sounding like characters reacting naturally to absurd situations, it often sounds like actors delivering whatever punchline the script handed them. That is a big difference. In the earlier movies, the comedy came from the personalities. Rick was reckless but charming. Evelyn was curious and brave, but also a little overwhelmed by the supernatural chaos around her. Jonathan was selfish and ridiculous, but he had a specific rhythm. You could feel the humor coming out of who these people were. Here, the humor feels pasted on. A fight happens, then someone says something cute. An explosion happens, then someone makes a quip. A romantic moment starts, then the film undercuts it with a gag. And yes, that can work in an adventure movie. But only if the jokes have snap. Only if the characters feel connected. Only if the movie has enough competence to let the comedy breathe. This one keeps forcing the moment. You can feel it trying to recreate the old banter, but the old chemistry is not there in the same way. Rick's lines do not have the same playful bounce. Evelyn's dialogue feels caught between imitation and reinvention. Jonathan still gets chances to be ridiculous, but even his comic relief sometimes feels like a leftover piece from a better version of the franchise. The movie also has this habit of going broad in a way that feels desperate. Not playful broad, not charmingly silly, just random. Like the script is throwing in strange little bits because it knows the story itself is not funny enough. And when a joke fails in a movie like this, it does more damage than you might expect. Because the humor is supposed to make the nonsense easier to accept. It is supposed to smooth over the ridiculous plot turns and keep the audience relaxed. If the jokes are working, you forgive a lot. You stop caring that the mythology barely makes sense. You stop worrying about the plot holes. You just ride the adventure. But when the jokes are weak, all that nonsense becomes more exposed. Suddenly, the silly dialogue is not charming anymore. It is just silly. The one-liners do not energize the scenes. They interrupt them. The banter does not build character. It reminds you that these characters are not clicking the way they used to. That is why the comedy feels so tired here. It is not that every joke is terrible. There are still a few small moments that work. John Hannah can still bring some life into a scene, and Brendan Fraser has enough natural charm that he can occasionally sell a line that probably looked weaker on the page. But overall, the writing keeps reaching for laughs it has not earned. And for a franchise that once got away with being ridiculous because it was fun, that is a serious problem. Because once the dialogue becomes forced and the jokes start falling flat, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor loses one of the main things that could have made its stupidity enjoyable. Now, we have to talk about the change that most people noticed before the movie even really got going. Rachel Weisz is not here, and for the Mummy franchise, that is not a small thing. Evelyn was not just the wife character or the person standing next to Rick while the adventure happened. In the first film especially, she was one of the main reasons the whole thing had charm. She brought intelligence, nervous energy, stubbornness, awkward humor, and this very specific warmth that balanced Rick's rougher adventure hero style. That version of Evelyn mattered. She was bookish but not weak, clumsy but not useless, romantic but not just a love interest. She had this slightly chaotic curiosity that made you believe, yes, this woman absolutely would read the wrong ancient text at the worst possible time and accidentally unleash something terrible. And that was part of the fun. So when the third movie opens and Rachel Weisz is simply gone, it creates an immediate gap. Even before you judge Maria Bello in the role, you feel the absence. It is not just a different actress walking into the same part. It is a missing piece of the franchise's personality, and the movie never fully solves that problem. To be fair, recasting happens. Actors leave franchises, schedules change, priorities change, people move on. That is not automatically fatal. A sequel can survive a recast if it handles the transition with confidence, or if the writing gives the new version of the character a strong reason to exist. But here, the film behaves almost like the audience is supposed to just accept it and keep moving. And sure, technically, you can do that. You understand that this is still supposed to be Evelyn. The story tells you she is Evelyn, the characters treat her as Evelyn, and the movie keeps going like nothing major has changed. But emotionally, something has changed. The old rhythm is gone. That is the part that hurts the film the most. Because Rick and Evelyn's relationship was one of the anchors of the earlier movies. Their chemistry helped sell the absurdity. When everything around them became ridiculous, their dynamic kept the movie grounded in a playful way. You believed they liked each other. You believed they frustrated each other. You believed they had history. Without Rachel Weisz, that history feels weirdly thinner. It is not just about missing a familiar face. It is about missing the energy she brought into every scene. Her Evelyn had a spark that made the adventure feel more personal. She was not simply reacting to the plot. She helped create the mood of the movie. In Tomb of the Dragon Emperor, that spark is absent, and the film does not pause long enough to compensate for it. It does not reshape the story in a way that makes the recast feel natural. It does not give Evelyn a fresh emotional angle strong enough to distract from the change. It just pushes forward into the next tomb, the next relic, the next burst of CGI. But the audience can still feel the difference. That is why Rachel Weisz's absence becomes bigger than a casting issue. It becomes a symbol of what the whole movie is missing. The film has the name, it has Rick, it has Jonathan, it has the ancient curse and the undead army and the big adventure structure. But one of the emotional ingredients that made the earlier films work is gone. And once that ingredient is missing, the sequel spends the rest of its runtime trying to convince us that the recipe still tastes the same. It does not. Maria Bello had a really difficult job in this movie, and honestly, that should be said before anything else. Because stepping into a role that audiences already associate with another actor is never easy. But stepping into this role, in this franchise, after Rachel Weisz had already made Evelyn such a fan-favorite part of the first two films, that is almost unfair from the start. The problem is not simply that Maria Bello is bad. She is not some talentless actor wandering into the movie by accident. She has done strong work elsewhere, and there are moments here where you can tell she is trying to make the role her own. She shows up, she commits, she gives the accent a go, she handles the adventure material as best as the script allows. But the movie never gives her a real chance to win the audience over. It just drops her into the role and acts like nothing has changed. And that is where the whole thing becomes awkward. Because this is supposed to be Evelyn O'Connell, same character, same history, same marriage, same past adventures, same emotional connection to Rick and Jonathan, and the whole mythology of the earlier films. But everything feels slightly off. The voice is different, the energy is different, the chemistry is different, even the way the character moves through scenes feels different. So instead of watching Evelyn, you spend half the time thinking, okay, this is the new Evelyn. That is never where you want the audience's mind to be. And the accent does not help. It becomes one of those performance choices that keeps calling attention to itself. Sometimes it sounds fine, sometimes it feels pushed, and sometimes it feels like Bello is concentrating so hard on sounding like Evelyn that the rest of the performance stiffens around it. That might sound harsh, but it is more a problem of fit than effort. Rachel Weisz's Evelyn had this effortless eccentricity. She could be elegant and awkward in the same breath. She could make a scholarly line sound funny without trying too hard. She had a very natural back and forth with Brendan Fraser, where the romance, irritation, and adventure partnership all felt like they belonged together. Maria Bello's version feels more like someone wearing the outline of that character, not because she is not trying, because the film does not rebuild Evelyn around her strengths. That is what a smarter sequel might have done. If you are going to recast such an important role, you either acknowledge the difference through the writing, or you reshape the character in a way that gives the new actor a clear identity. Let this Evelyn feel older, changed, more restless, more complicated. Give her a real emotional arc. Give her scenes that make us stop comparing and start accepting. But Tomb of the Dragon Emperor does not really do that. It wants Maria Bello to simply slide into the old space Rachel Weisz left behind, and that space is too specific, too familiar, too tied to the first movie's charm. So even when Bello is doing perfectly serviceable work, the movie keeps working against her. The script gives her clunky dialogue, the romance with Rick feels weaker, and the character herself no longer has the same spark of curiosity and comic timing that made Evelyn so memorable. The result is not a disaster, exactly. It is just jarring. And in a movie already struggling to feel like a proper continuation, that recast becomes another reminder that something essential has shifted. You can see what the film wants us to believe, that the O'Connells are back, the adventure is back, the old magic is back. But with Evelyn feeling this different, the illusion never fully holds. Maria Bello may have accepted the role, but the movie never figures out how to make her feel like she truly belongs in it. The recasting of Evelyn is already distracting, but what makes it harder is that the character herself does not feel quite the same either. That is the part that really throws the movie off. Because even if you accept Maria Bello as the new Evelyn, even if you push Rachel Weisz out of your mind and try to meet this version on her own terms, the writing still does not give her the same personality that made Evelyn such a memorable part of the earlier films. In the first movie, Evelyn had a very clear identity. She was curious, nervous, brilliant, clumsy in a charming way. She had this love for history that felt sincere, and that love was often what pulled the story forward. She was not just reacting to Rick's adventure. In many ways, she was the reason the adventure existed. She opened the wrong book. She chased knowledge. She believed in old things before everyone else took them seriously. That made her important. In Tomb of the Dragon Emperor, Evelyn feels more like she's been smoothed out into a generic adventure wife role. The movie gives her things to do, sure, but not much that feels uniquely hers. Her old scholarly spark is not as strong. Her comic awkwardness is toned down. Her relationship with danger feels less personal. And instead of feeling like the same woman who once stumbled into an ancient curse because she was too fascinated to leave it alone, she feels like someone being carried along by the franchise machinery. There is also this attempt to show Rick and Evelyn as older, settled, maybe even a little bored with normal life. That could have been interesting. Honestly, it could have given Evelyn a strong new angle. What happens when someone who once lived for discovery is now stuck trying to be respectable? What happens when adventure is no longer romanticized, but missed? There is something there, but the movie barely explores it. It brings up the idea, then rushes past it. Instead of using Evelyn's changed life to deepen her, the film mostly turns it into setup. She is retired, she is restless, she gets pulled back into danger, and that is basically it. The inner life of the character does not get much attention. Her personal desires, her relationship with aging, her identity beyond being Rick's wife and Alex's mother, all of that stays thin. And that is disappointing because Evelyn used to be one of the franchise's main sources of personality. Here, she feels oddly muted. Even her humor does not have the same texture. The earlier Evelyn could be funny because she was so specific. Her reactions came from a real character. This version gets lines, but fewer moments that feel like only Evelyn would say or do them. The script seems to understand that she needs to be present, but not why she mattered. That is why the character change hurts more than the recast alone. A different actress might have worked if the writing had protected the essence of Evelyn, or a different version of Evelyn might have worked if the film had given her a strong new emotional direction. But the movie does neither clearly enough. It changes the face, changes the energy, and softens the character's identity all at once. So instead of feeling like Evelyn has grown, it feels like Evelyn has been replaced twice. Once by a new actress, and again by weaker writing. The result is a character who should feel like one of the emotional anchors of the movie, but instead feels strangely disconnected from the parts of the franchise that made her important in the first place. One of the biggest things you feel missing in Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is the chemistry between Rick and Evelyn. And I know that sounds obvious because, yes, Rachel Weisz is gone. Of course, the chemistry is going to feel different. But the issue is not only that the actors changed, it is that the whole relationship feels less alive than it used to. In the earlier films, Rick and Evelyn had a very easy kind of spark. They were not written like some perfect romantic couple. That was never the appeal. They bickered, they got annoyed. They rushed into danger for completely different reasons. Rick was more physical, more instinctive, more shoot first and figure it out later. Evelyn was more curious, more scholarly, more likely to understand the ancient thing that everyone else should probably stop touching. That contrast worked. You believed they frustrated each other, but you also believed they loved each other. You believed they had history. You believed that even when the movie went completely insane around them, there was this playful partnership holding the center together. In this third film, that center feels weak. Rick and Evelyn are supposed to be older now, settled into married life, maybe a little bored, maybe missing the danger more than they want to admit. That is not a bad idea. In fact, it could have been a really nice way to bring them back. You could explore what happens when two people who once lived on chaos try to live quietly. You could show the adventure pulling them back together. You could make their relationship feel changed, but still recognizable. But the movie does not really find that emotional rhythm. Instead, their marriage feels strangely flat. There are lines meant to suggest affection. There are little attempts at banter. There are moments where the film wants us to feel that old Rick and Evie energy again, but it rarely clicks naturally. It feels performed rather than felt. And that hurts more than people might expect, because the romance was one of the reasons the original adventure worked so well. The first Mummy was not just about stopping an ancient evil. It was also about watching these two completely different people get pulled toward each other through danger, absurdity, and supernatural chaos. Their connection gave the movie warmth. Here, the relationship feels like a plot fact. They are married because the story says they are married. They have history because we remembered the previous movies. But this movie itself does not make that history feel present in the room. Part of it is the recast, obviously. Brendan Fraser and Maria Bello just do not have the same screen rhythm that Fraser and Weisz had. Bello is trying. Fraser is doing what he can, but the back and forth feels heavier. The jokes do not bounce. The romantic beats do not glow. Even the scenes that are supposed to show tension between them feel underwritten. Like the movie knows the couple should have problems but does not know how to make those problems emotionally interesting. And that is a missed opportunity. because Rick and Evelyn being older could have added something. Their marriage could have been tired in a funny way or strained in a real way or reignited by the adventure in a satisfying way. The film could have used their relationship as the emotional spine of the story. But instead, it gets treated like another familiar ingredient. Ancient curse? Check. Magical relic? Check. Rick and Evelyn banter? Check. Except the banter is not enough. The chemistry is not enough. The emotional charge is not enough. So when the movie tries to bring back that old romantic adventure feeling, it mostly reminds you of what is missing. You remember how effortless the earlier dynamic felt, and suddenly, this version looks even more awkward by comparison. That is the sad thing about it. The movie wants Rick and Evelyn to feel like the heart of the franchise again, but this time, the heartbeat is faint. Brendan Fraser returning as Rick O'Connell should have been the easiest win in this movie, because even when the Mummy films got ridiculous, and they got ridiculous a lot, Fraser was always one of the main reasons they stayed watchable. He had that rare adventure hero quality where he could be square-jawed and goofy at the same time. He looked like he could survive a fight, but also like he was constantly one bad decision away from causing an even bigger disaster. That balance mattered. Rick was not a cold action hero. He was not a flawless warrior walking through danger with perfect confidence. He was more fun than that. He had sarcasm, panic, charm, physicality, and just enough stupidity to make the impossible situations feel entertaining instead of mechanical. So when he comes back in Tomb of the Dragon Emperor, there is still some comfort in seeing him again. Fraser knows this character, you can tell. He understands the rhythm of Rick better than almost anyone else in the movie, understands their own role. Even when the script gives him weak lines, he can still make a moment feel lighter just by being present. There are little flashes where you remember why this character worked in the first place, but the problem is, those flashes are not consistent. For much of the film, Rick feels tired. Not older in an interesting way, not worn down in a way that adds depth, just tired. The energy that used to make him bounce through these movies feels lower here, like the character is being pulled back into the franchise because the story needs him, not because he has a fresh reason to be there. And to be fair, that could have been turned into something. Rick aging out of adventure, feeling bored by retirement, struggling to connect with his grown son, there is material there. You could absolutely build a funny, slightly emotional version of Rick around the idea that he does not know what to do when the world is not ending. That might have given Fraser something new to play, but the movie does not dig into that enough. Instead, Rick mostly becomes a familiar shape. The jacket, the gun, the jokes, the action scenes, the heroic timing. All the pieces are there, but they feel a little worn. He still runs, fights, shoots, and throws out lines in the middle of danger, but the spark is dimmer than before. And that is not entirely Fraser's fault. The script does not give him the same chemistry to work with. Evelyn feels different. Alex does not create a strong enough emotional challenge for him. Jonathan is around, but their comic rhythm is thinner. Even the villain does not give Rick the same kind of personal or supernatural tension that Imhotep once did. So Fraser ends up carrying a lot of the movie on familiarity alone. Sometimes that is enough for a scene. Sometimes it is even enough for a whole stretch of the film. There is still something naturally likable about him in this role, and if you have any affection for the earlier movies, you probably want to enjoy watching him again. But wanting to enjoy him is not the same as the movie fully using him. That is what makes his performance feel so mixed. On one hand, Brendan Fraser remains one of the few reasons the sequel has any connection to the old charm. On the other hand, he seems less energized, less sharp, and less alive inside the adventure than he once was. It is not a terrible performance. It is just a familiar performance trapped in a movie that cannot quite bring the character back to life. And in a story about resurrected ancient powers, that is a little ironic. Introducing Alex as a grown man could have been a smart move for the third film. On paper, it makes sense. Rick and Evelyn are older now. The franchise has moved forward in time, and the idea of their son stepping into the same dangerous world gives the movie a natural next-generation angle. There is something potentially fun about seeing the child of these two reckless adventurers becoming an adventurer himself. Of course, Alex would be curious. Of course, he would dig where he should not dig. Of course, he would inherit the family talent for waking up things that were better left buried. That part works as a concept. The problem is the movie never makes Alex interesting enough to justify how much space he takes. Luke Ford is not terrible in the role, but he does not bring the kind of spark this character badly needs. Alex should feel like a younger extension of the O'Connell energy. Cocky, restless, reckless, maybe a little immature, but still charismatic enough that you understand why the movie wants him there. Instead, he often comes across bland, not aggressively awful, not scene-destroying, just sort of there. And in a movie already struggling to recapture its old personality, that is a problem. Because Alex is supposed to help refresh the series. He is supposed to bring new energy into the family dynamic. He is supposed to complicate Rick's role, push the story into a new generation, and maybe even give the franchise a future beyond the original trio. But he never really feels strong enough for that. The film wants us to see him as this grown son who is trying to prove himself. He has been off doing his own archaeological work, he has discovered the Emperor's tomb, and he clearly wants to be taken seriously. That should create tension. Rick should see too much of himself in Alex. Evelyn should have complicated feelings about her son choosing danger. Alex should feel caught between wanting approval and wanting independence. There is material there, but the writing only touches it lightly. Instead of feeling like a fully developed character, Alex often feels like a function. He discovers the tomb. He creates the family reunion. He gives Rick someone to argue with. He gives the movie a younger romantic subplot. He helps move the plot forward, but as a personality, he does not leave much behind. And it does not help that the casting makes the family dynamic feel strange. Alex looks mature enough that the age gap between him and Rick does not always feel convincing, which makes the father-son relationship a little harder to buy visually. You can accept it because the movie tells you to accept it, but it never feels effortless. That matters more than it should. Because when a sequel introduces the hero's grown child, the emotional connection needs to feel natural. You need to believe the family history immediately. You need to feel the tension under the jokes. You need to sense that these people have years of unresolved stuff between them. Here, it feels more like the movie has inserted Alex because a third installment needed a new piece on the board. He is not written badly enough to ruin the film by himself, but he is not memorable enough to improve it either, and that is probably the most frustrating thing about him. He is designed to be important, but he does not feel important. Even his romance with Lynn does not add much emotional weight. It gives the movie another subplot, another reason to connect the O'Connells to the ancient curse, but it never becomes compelling enough to make Alex feel like the emotional center of the story. So what you are left with is a character who should have helped the franchise grow, but mostly reminds you that the old magic is fading. Alex O'Connell is not the worst idea in the movie. He is just another example of a good idea that needed more charm, more writing, and a much stronger reason to exist. The father-son relationship between Rick and Alex should have been one of the emotional engines of Tomb of the Dragon Emperor. Because once the movie brings in a grown Alex, it is clearly trying to shift the family dynamic. Rick is no longer just the reckless hero. He is a father watching his son step into the same dangerous world he once survived. Alex is no longer the little kid from the second film. He is older, more independent, and determined to prove he can handle himself. That setup should create natural tension. There is an easy emotional idea here. Rick spent his life running into danger, and now he has to watch his own son do the exact same thing. Maybe he sees Alex as careless. Maybe Alex sees Rick as overprotective. Maybe both of them are too stubborn to admit that they are more alike than they want to be. That could have worked, but the movie handles it in the most basic way possible. Rick and Alex argue a little. Alex wants to be treated like an adult. Rick struggles to see him that way. There is some bickering, some action movie bonding, and eventually they end up on the same side because, well, of course they do. The structure is there, but the feeling is thin. It never really digs into the relationship. You do not get much sense of what their life has been like between movies. You do not feel years of distance, resentment, admiration, or misunderstanding. The movie tells us there is tension, but it does not make that tension specific enough to become interesting. And that is where the father-son angle starts to feel familiar in the worst way. It is not bad because it is a common idea. Plenty of adventure movies use this kind of dynamic. The older hero and the younger rebel. The father who cannot let go. The son who wants respect. Done well, it can bring warmth and emotional stakes to a blockbuster. But here, it mostly feels like a box being checked. The film knows a third movie needs something different, so it gives Rick a grown son with a chip on his shoulder. But Alex is not vivid enough, and Rick is not written with enough emotional conflict, so their scenes do not carry the weight they should. There is also something slightly strange about how quickly the movie moves past the more interesting parts. Alex has basically followed the family legacy into archaeology and danger. That should mean something to Rick and Evelyn. It should be funny, worrying, maybe even painful. After everything they have survived, their son is now digging up cursed history too. But the movie treats it more like a plot device. Alex discovers the tomb, the Emperor returns, and the family is forced together again. After that, the emotional side mostly gets swallowed by chases, monsters, and CGI spectacle. And honestly, that is a shame, because a stronger father-son story could have given the sequel the heart it is missing. It could have made the adventure feel personal. It could have turned the movie into more than just another ancient villain waking up and threatening the world. Rick could have been fighting not only to stop the Emperor, but to protect his son while learning to respect him. Alex could have been fighting not only to prove himself, but to understand the cost of the life his parents once lived. Instead, their relationship stays on the surface. You can see what the movie wants us to feel, but you rarely feel it deeply. The reconciliation does not hit hard because the conflict never had enough texture. The bonding moments do not land strongly because the characters have not been developed with enough patience. So by the end, the father-son dynamic does not ruin the movie. It just fails to save it. And that might be worse, because this was one of the few new emotional angles the third film had. Anthony Wong could have made the human side of the villain plan more compelling. Isabella Leong could have made the Alex storyline feel more personal. Jet Li and Yo together should have delivered a moment with real weight and excitement, but most of it feels underused. Not because the actors are incapable, because the movie is more interested in scale than character. And that is a recurring problem throughout Tomb of the Dragon Emperor. It keeps collecting impressive pieces, famous actors, huge locations, ancient mythology, supernatural armies, but it does not always know how to turn those pieces into drama. So the supporting cast becomes another missed opportunity. They give the movie credibility. They give it some visual and cultural texture. They make certain scenes feel more important than the writing deserves, but they are rarely allowed to shape the movie in a meaningful way. And when a film has this much talent standing around yet still feels thin, that tells you the issue is not the cast. It is what the film fails to do with them. One of the smaller bright spots in Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is Liam Cunningham. And I know, he is not exactly the first name people bring up when they talk about this movie. Most of the discussion usually goes straight to Brendan Fraser, Rachel Weisz being absent, Maria Bello stepping in, Jet Li being underused, or Michelle Yeoh not getting enough screen time. But Cunningham is worth mentioning because he brings a little bit of personality into a movie that often feels oddly drained of it. His role is not huge. Tomb of the Dragon Emperor does manage that for some viewers. It has a kind of summer afternoon energy where the flaws are obvious, but the movie is too busy to become completely lifeless. There are scenes where it almost settles into dumb fun. A chase begins, the pace picks up, the story stops trying to explain itself, and for a few minutes the movie becomes easier to accept. You stop worrying about the missing chemistry, the weak villain, the convenient mythology, and the fact that the franchise has clearly lost some of its old spark. You just let the noise happen. And sometimes that is enough, but only sometimes. Because the issue is that popcorn entertainment still needs flavor, it still needs charm, it still needs a reason to be remembered after the popcorn is gone. The first Mummy understood that. It was not smart in some elevated dramatic sense, but it had character. It had personality. It had a lightness that made the ridiculous parts easier to enjoy. This third movie is more uneven. It can entertain you moment by moment, but it rarely pulls you into that joyful adventure mood for long. One scene works as harmless fun, then the next reminds you how thin the writing is. One action beat gives the movie a little life, then a forced joke drains the energy. One visual looks impressive, then another CGI-heavy moment pulls you out again. So the entertainment value is there, but it comes in bursts. That is probably the fairest way to describe it. If someone says they had a decent time with Tomb of the Dragon Emperor, I get it. There is enough spectacle, enough movement, and enough familiar franchise material to make it watchable. It is not a total dead zone. It is not impossible to sit through. For casual viewing, especially if you are already fond of this kind of supernatural adventure nonsense, it can still work on a very simple level. But if someone says it is a disappointing sequel, I get that even more. because watchable is not the same as good, and passable is not the same as satisfying. Tomb of the Dragon Emperor survives as popcorn entertainment because it keeps moving and occasionally remembers how fun this franchise can be. But it never becomes the kind of popcorn movie that makes you forget its flaws. It is more like a noisy distraction with a few enjoyable moments scattered throughout. Not worthless, not painful every second. Just a film that works best when you ask very little from it. The strange thing about Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is that even when it is watchable, it does not really stay with you. And that might be the most honest criticism of the movie, because there are worse films out there. Obviously. This is not some completely broken disaster where every scene is painful and nothing works at all. It has money behind it. It has recognizable actors. It has big locations, action scenes, supernatural imagery, and enough movement to keep the experience from becoming totally dead. But once it is over, it starts fading almost immediately. You remember the idea of the movie more than the movie itself. You remember that there was a Chinese emperor. You remember that Rachel Weisz was gone. You remember there were Yetis for some reason. You remember Jet Li was in it, but maybe not as much as you wanted. You remember a lot of CGI, a lot of running, a lot of noise, and a final battle with armies smashing into each other. But individual scenes, specific emotions, lines that stick, moments you want to revisit, that is where the movie struggles. The first Mummy had memorable texture. Even if you had not watched it in years, certain things stayed in your head. Rick's introduction, Evelyn knocking over the library shelves, Imhotep's curse, the scarabs, the sandface, the banter, the romantic energy, the feeling of adventure discovering itself as it went along. This third film has plenty of events, but not many moments. That is a big difference. Events are things that happen in the plot. Moments are things the audience carries away. And Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is full of events. Ancient backstory, tomb discovery, emperor resurrected, family reunion, Shanghai, Himalayas, Shangri-La, Yetis, dragon, army battle. It sounds packed when you list it, but somehow the experience feels oddly weightless. Part of that is because the movie does not give its scenes enough emotional shape. It rushes from one piece of spectacle to the next, so very little has time to settle. The character beats are too thin, the jokes are too uneven, the villain is too generic, and the action is too repetitive to create lasting impact. So instead of remembering a scene because it moved you, thrilled you, or made you laugh, you mostly remember that the movie was busy. And busy is not the same as memorable. That is probably why the film occupies such a strange place in the franchise. People remember the first one with affection. Some people still defend the second because it has enough ridiculous energy and familiar chemistry to feel connected to the original. But the third one often feels like the entry people have to remind themselves exists. It is not invisible exactly, but it is faint. It does not leave a strong emotional footprint. It does not create a new iconic villain. It does not give Rick and Evelyn a powerful final chapter. It does not make Alex feel like the future of the franchise. It does not use the Chinese setting in a way that becomes unforgettable. It has the ingredients for several memorable scenes, but most of them pass by without the force they should have. And that is why watchable becomes such a limited compliment. A movie can be watchable and still feel disposable. You can sit through it without suffering and still have no real desire to return to it. You can enjoy a few bursts of action and still forget the shape of the story a week later. You can appreciate the effort, the scale, the costumes, the scenery, and still feel like the film never truly claimed a place in your memory. That is where Tomb of the Dragon Emperor lands. Not awful enough to be fascinating, not good enough to be beloved, not strange enough to become a cult favorite, not charming enough to stand beside the original. It just sort of exists in the middle, loud, expensive, mildly entertaining, and strangely forgettable. And for a franchise built on ancient things refusing to stay buried, this is the one entry that disappears the fastest once the credits roll. What is interesting about Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is that the reaction to it is not completely one-sided. A lot of people hate this movie. Let's be honest about that. For many fans, it is easily the weakest entry in the trilogy. The missing Rachel Weisz, the weaker chemistry, the overdone CGI, the generic villain, the forced jokes, the strange Yetis, the recycled formula. All of that adds up to a sequel that feels like it lost the charm of the earlier films. If someone says, this is where the franchise fully ran out of energy, I understand exactly where they are coming from, but at the same time, there are viewers who defend it. Not always passionately, but enough to say, look, it is not that bad. And honestly, that reaction makes sense too. If you go into this movie expecting a big, silly, effects-heavy adventure, there is entertainment here. It moves quickly. It has a different setting. Brendan Fraser is still around. There are monsters, fights, relics, curses, armies, dragons, and ridiculous supernatural nonsense. For some people, that is enough. And that is where the film becomes kind of tricky to judge. Because it is bad in ways that are easy to explain, but enjoyable in ways that are also easy to understand. It depends heavily on what you want from it. If you want a strong sequel to the original Mummy, this movie is probably a major disappointment. It does not have the same spark. It does not have the same chemistry. It does not have the same clean sense of pulpy adventure. It feels colder, louder, and more manufactured. But if you just want a casual popcorn movie that you can throw on without thinking too deeply, then yeah, it can pass the time. You might enjoy the scenery. You might enjoy some of the action. You might laugh at how absurd it gets. You might even appreciate that the movie never pretends to be smarter than it is. That does not make it good. But it does explain why not everyone reacts to it with the same level of frustration. There is also the low expectation effect. Sometimes when a movie has such a bad reputation, you go in expecting a complete disaster, and then when it turns out to be merely messy, you almost feel relieved. You start thinking, okay, this is dumb, but I have seen worse. And that feeling can make the movie seem more enjoyable than it probably is. That is fair, but it also says a lot about the level we are judging it on. Nobody is really defending Tomb of the Dragon Emperor as some misunderstood classic. The defense is usually more modest than that. It is watchable. It has decent action. It looks good in places. It is harmless, dumb fun. It is fine if you already like this kind of thing. And those are not meaningless compliments. A film does not have to be great to be enjoyed. But for a franchise that once had real personality, harmless feels like a step down. The first Mummy was not just something to leave on in the background. It had charm. It had scenes people remembered. It had a romantic adventure energy that made the silliness feel special. This third movie mostly survives on leftovers from that affection. That is why the mixed reception makes sense. The people who hate it are responding to what it lost. The people who defend it are responding to what still barely works. And both sides have a point. Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is not a total failure as light entertainment, but it is a failure as the lively, charming, franchise-expanding sequel it clearly wanted to be. It can be enjoyed if you lower the bar enough, but the fact that you have to lower the bar at all says plenty. So in the end, the split reaction is almost the perfect summary of the movie itself. Too expensive and active to dismiss completely. Too hollow and forgettable to fully embrace. So where does the Mummy, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor finally land? Honestly, somewhere in that awkward space between not completely terrible and still really disappointing. Because this is not a movie with zero entertainment value. It has action, it has scale, it has a few fun ideas. Brendan Fraser is still easy to like, even when the material around him is weaker. The Chinese setting gives the franchise a different visual flavor. There are moments of spectacle, moments of pace, moments where the movie briefly becomes the kind of silly popcorn adventure it clearly wants to be. But those moments are not enough to make the film work as a whole. The biggest problem is that Tomb of the Dragon Emperor keeps looking like a bigger movie while feeling like a smaller one emotionally. It has more CGI, more mythology, more locations, more creatures, more battles, more noise, but somehow less charm. Less chemistry, less mystery, less personality, and that is a bad trade. The first Mummy was ridiculous, but it had life. The second one was messier, but it still carried enough of the original energy to feel connected. This third movie feels like the franchise trying to continue after losing too many of the things that made it enjoyable in the first place. Rachel Weisz is gone, and the movie never recovers from that loss. Maria Bello is put in a difficult position and never fully feels like Evelyn. Rick and Evelyn's chemistry is weaker. Alex does not bring enough spark as the grown son. Jonathan is still around, but even his comic relief feels more familiar than fresh. Jet Li should have been a fantastic villain, but Emperor Han is too flat and too often buried under effects. Michelle Yeoh and the supporting cast add class, but the script does not give them enough to truly shape the movie. Then there is the story itself. It is thin, convenient, and overloaded. The movie has a new setting, but not a new soul. It swaps Egypt for China, mummies for terracotta warriors, and desert adventure for mountains, dragons, and Shangri-La. but the basic structure still feels recycled. Ancient evil wakes up. Magical object matters. Heroes chase clues. Villain wants immortality. Big CGI army arrives. We have seen the shape before. And this version does not bring enough surprise to make it feel new. That is what makes the movie so frustrating. It had real potential. A Chinese mythology-based mummy sequel with Jet Li, Michelle Yeoh, the Terracotta Army, and an older O'Connell family could have been a fresh, exciting third chapter. It could have expanded the franchise in a meaningful way. It could have given the series a new texture. Instead, it mostly becomes a loud late 2000s blockbuster with the Mummy name attached. Everything is bigger, but very little is better. The action keeps it moving, but the action is often repetitive or chaotic. The visuals can be attractive, but the CGI is excessive and sometimes distracting. The humor tries to bring back the old lightness, but too many jokes feel forced. The film wants to be epic, funny, emotional, scary, romantic, and fantastical all at once, but it never finds the balance that made the earlier films work. And that is why it ends up feeling so forgettable. Not because nothing happens. A lot happens, maybe too much happens. But very little of it sticks. The movie fills the screen, yet leaves behind almost no emotional aftertaste. You remember the idea of it, the Chinese emperor, the missing Rachel Weisz, the Yetis, the CGI armies, more than you remember the actual experience of watching it. So the final verdict is pretty simple. Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is watchable if you lower your expectations and just want a noisy fantasy adventure with familiar faces and constant movement. It can pass the time. It has a few enjoyable pieces. It is not impossible to sit through. But as a sequel to The Mummy, it is easily the weakest chapter. It lacks the heart of the first film, the chemistry of the original cast, the pulpy horror adventure charm, and the sense of fun that made this franchise work even when it was being completely absurd. It is bigger than the earlier movies in scale, but smaller in almost every way that matters.